was in high school, the two iconic figures in my life growing up were Walt Disney and Albert Einstein. And I originally wanted to be an animator. I couldn't see how to learn how to be an animator after I got out of high school. So I switched over into physics. And it was there while I was studying physics that the brand new field of computer science was arising. And when that occurred, then I switched over to computer science right at the very end. And then I came back to graduate school at the University of Utah, where it was funded to do computer graphics research. And my first course was a computer graphics course, which I just took because it sounded interesting. But that course changed my life because now I could see that the art and the technology could be combined. But it didn't seem like an unusual idea. It just felt like, oh, this is an opportunity. So I never thought of them as being incongruent, the science and the technology. It's just that they belong together. So it was a natural outcome. And even though we were early on mostly technical people, we knew that if people focused on the technology that we would have failed. But fundamentally, it's about the story. So when we work on a story through all these years, the first version of it always sucks. There's something wrong with it. And right from the beginning, we understood that's what happened, is that the first version is the shallow one, and that you need to dig deeper to find something that's of meaning. And we took a lot of pride, and still take a lot of pride, in that most of our films would fail the elevator test. So I don't know how many people are familiar with the elevator test, but the notion is that you work very hard to come up with a short summation of what you want to do so that you can explain it to the head of your company in the elevator when you go from the bottom to the top. And from my point of view, that if you can do that, you can only do it if you thought of something that's derivative, that you have to work on something which is not obvious that it would work. And to be creative, you have to tackle hard problems. And what that means is you don't know what the answers are when you start. So if you find the answer too soon, then you probably have got something which is derivative and shallow. The other thing to know is that we learned that we pick our directors based upon their passion and their ability to tell stories. So the thing I think that makes us different is we pick a director and then we ask them to come up with 3 ideas. And we never give to them the idea that we want them to make, because then they're trying to satisfy us. We want them to try to follow their passion. And the reason we pick 3 ideas is that, as you know, you get stuck sometimes. So when we say pick 3 ideas, what we're really saying is if you get stuck, move on to something else. We're trying to put processes in place to keep people from running into barriers. So when they can switch to a different idea, they do. So at the end of a year, after they've been working on these 3 ideas, they then present the 3 ideas to the creative leadership. Now, the interesting thing is the purpose of that meeting is not for the creative leadership to pick what they think is the best idea. The purpose of that meeting is for the creative leadership to figure out which one the director really wants to make, because they won't admit it when they present the stories. They'll say they love all 3 of them equally. Well, it's not true. They actually do like one more than the other. So we're trying to deduce from their presentation where their passion is. And if you base it upon the passion and their skill, then you're far more likely to come up with something which is original. Oh, definitely. I define creativity very broadly in that it's solving the problems. And in our case, of course, it has to do with stories, but there's also the creativity in how you make the films, what the technology is, how we interact with people. But there are issues we all have in our lives in terms of personal relationships or business relationships. And we sometimes have got some very difficult problems. And we can ignore them, we can bull our way through them, we can try all sorts of things. But the best solutions are where somebody works creatively to figure out how to solve the problem and in a way that's very inclusive. So this is hard, but it is a creative act and anybody can do it. So the issue, I think, in any environment is what are the things that are preventing people from being creative? So they might be the fear, they feel vulnerable, they feel like they might be punished if they make a mistake. And a lot of this is imagined, like they imagine the worst. And when they start to second guess themselves or worry about how they're being judged, then they're not thinking about solving the problem. They're actually caught up in this loop, which is a barrier to creativity. And that our job is to actually make the environment and genuinely make it safe for people to try things, have them not work, and have it be okay, because we trust that they're trying to solve the problem. That's all we need is that confidence that the people are behind them and helping them to solve the problems. I believe that creativity does become more difficult at scale. I think that sometimes there's this illusion that the creative person is the lone genius sitting by themselves, which I don't think is a good way to be creative. Being creative is in a context, as part of communication. It involves being with other people. Hence, in our case, it isn't just there's a brain trust, but there's a creative team on every film that works together. So there are thousands or hundreds of thousands of decisions that go into any film, or for that matter, any product. And you do need some leadership to say how these pieces fit together. There may be brilliant ideas, they just don't happen to support the film or the product. But it's definitely a collaborative effort. But on the other hand, as we know, if a group is too big, then that the ability to work together starts to get more difficult. So there is a scale problem. So there are different ways of addressing the scale problem. One of them is you start to become formulaic. You have got a set way of doing things. So you can produce more material, but it's not as original. So the balance is always, how do you have the right set of people, the right group of people, and not have such a machine going that you inadvertently sort of squash the creativity because you're trying to hit some schedule. It is difficult. I've always felt like the optimal team is probably around 100 people on a film. Now, we're nowhere near that. It's more like 300 people. But nobody was ever saying, oh, the ideal film is made by 2 people. It actually is a collaboration with quite a few. Finding the sweet spot is dependent upon the people, the problem, and other economic factors that are in place there. So I have no simple solution to it other than the fact that, let's not kid ourselves. If we want to be original and creative, we have to be taking on things that are hard, and the way you tackle them is you include other people in it who are part of the solution. So that's the thing where getting the scale right is very difficult. Well, initially we had a software and hard contract with Disney, which is how we began the relationship. Then Pixar developed to the point where we could make a feature-length film, and we entered into a contract with Disney so that we were the producers of the film and they were the marketers. So for about 10 years, that was our relationship, was a business relationship. Then when Bob Iger became the CEO of Disney, then Disney decided that they wanted to acquire Pixar. And as part of that, we set up some mechanisms to protect Pixar. And the mechanisms to protect Pixar were supposed to be in place for about 5 years. Now, the reality is it's now 15 years later, and the mechanisms are still in place because they work. Now, part of that is we worked hard to keep Pixar as a separate entity with its own identity, which I think is very important. We're on a different finance system, different HR system, different healthcare program, and they're just part of a local identity. So we didn't try to get economies of scale or to merge or anything like that. In fact, it was to protect that identity. That was extraordinarily successful. It was so successful that enabled Bob Iger to take a further risk and buy Marvel, and then to buy Lucasfilm, the Star Wars franchise. But they came out of recognizing that groups need to have their own separate identity. So with Pixar, it worked very well because we could maintain the identity. But the second thing that was interesting was that at that time, when Disney acquired Pixar, which is in 2006, then I was made the president of Disney Animation. And there were people who felt that we should merge Pixar and Disney Animation or shut down Disney Animation. Like, those are the two opinions. My view, and I was supported by Bob Iger in this, was that we were going to have two separate studios, and the rule was that they could not do any production work for each other. They could talk with each other, they could beg, borrow, and steal ideas, but they didn't have to. There was no existential threat. Disney worked in a different way than Pixar did, and if one did something better than the other, then we were open about it, but we never said you need to use best practices and do what the other studio does. And turns out this was really important, because what we did was we removed the threat, or the existential threat, of one studio over the other. We set it up so there wasn't a winner or a loser in terms of our processes or how we did things. And because there was no existential threat, there was complete free sharing of information and processes, and they called each other, and they self-organized into a conference where they met every year to talk about how they did things. And they could freely share what they did because they knew there were no negative consequences in doing that. And I didn't organize this conference. They just did it on their own. And another reason for making sure there were two studios, and this is not obvious to a lot of companies, is because people would normally say, if you've got two groups that are in the same business, then why would you duplicate R&D? Why would you duplicate marketing? Why would you duplicate the finance group? And why would you have two different pipelines? That's be the normal thinking, which I saw competitors do. And that's just wrong. The real problem is that the industry is changing so fast that we're far better off having two groups who have different ideas about how to advance, but they like each other and they share with each other. So the result is we can iterate and learn faster in a supportive way. And I think it's been one of the big wins was the fact that we kept them separate. So Disney basically was very supportive of this, and it's still the way it is today. There's just two different studios. Oh, well, I'm happy where they ended up. So I think that what we did originally was counterintuitive. As I say, there were people at the time who thought that we shouldn't do it, and they had logical reasons why we shouldn't do it. One of them was that John Lasseter was the chief creative officer at the time, that we would be spread too thin in running two studios. So that's definitely a risk, and it's a logical point to raise. But we felt very strongly that it was important that Disney animation be healthy and whole. So we took this path of trying to make sure both were healthy and whole and separate from each other. So that's one where I feel very happy with the approach that we took, because it's not the obvious one. So I wouldn't go back on what I think worked very well. Now, we also made mistakes along the way. I learned long ago that about half the things I think of or try are just plain wrong. And that's not even a bad thing. It's just part of learning. So we found in the process that there were things that we didn't get right. When Disney acquired Pixar, the idea that I had was that Disney, while it wasn't successful at the time, would teach us something, because in trying to apply the principles that we had developed to a different group of people, that we would learn when the principles were the thing that made things work, or when it was just because we happened to have the right people. Because sometimes you can't tell the difference between the way you work and the value of certain individuals, but that you don't fully acknowledge at the time. And in fact, when Disney started to make successful films, they were doing things in a different way than Pixar, and I didn't know what the difference was. I couldn't figure out why was Disney being successful, because they lacked a couple of the key elements and the key things that made Pixar work, but they were successful in any case. So what was I missing? But that's what I wanted in the first place, was to have two different groups doing things, and in learning something from that would actually inform the other. So in this particular case, it was, for me, kind of a funny incident. There was a time in which I wanted to have the president of Pixar, or my successor. Actually, he wasn't president then, he was general manager. But we wanted to meet with every single group at Pixar. And I was in the lobby of Pixar, and the lobby is set up to have accidental encounters. People run into each other all the time. To me, Pixar probably has one of the best designed working environments that I've ever seen. It's really extraordinary. But I was walking through the atrium, and I bumped into one of our writers. The writers all work for Pixar or for Disney under contract. So they're not employees. I ran into him, and he said, well, I hear that you're meeting with all the different groups to talk about issues or problems. And I said, yeah, that's right. And he said, why aren't you meeting with the writers? And so it caught me off guard. So the first thing I thought in my head, and I didn't say this, but the first thing I thought was, well, we're not meeting with the writers because the writers don't actually work for the company. They're separate contractors. And then the second thought that I had, and I didn't say anything, but my second thought was, this is really cool. He believes that he's part of Pixar. That's awesome. So what I said was, you're absolutely right. We made a mistake. We're going to set it up to meet with the writers. So we met with the writers, both at Pixar and at Disney. And what I realized at the time was that at Pixar, we were only having the writer of the film, in our brain trust meetings. And that was just part of the way the original contract was set up with them. The other writers on different films weren't in that meeting. And at Disney, the writers' contract was that they could all come to all of the Brain Trust meetings. Now, when I mentioned there was a difference between the two studios, the difference was at Pixar, we had some of the directors like Andrew Stanton and Lee Unkrich, who had brilliant structural minds. And those brilliant structural minds were at Pixar, but they were not at Disney. So I didn't know why Disney was doing as well, because they didn't have those particular skill sets of those people. But it was at that meeting where I realized, oh, the difference is that writers who tend to think in terms of internal structure, they were all at the Disney Brain Trust meetings. So that's when I learned, okay, that's the difference. They provided that missing piece that I didn't understand. But then we also went back to Pixar and we changed the contracts with the writers so that all the writers could come because they happened to have the right kind of thinking for solving storytelling problems, which is the kind of people you want in the room. So this was an improvement that took place because of a chance encounter and recognizing that there was a mystery that we needed to solve. But that's the job. What's the mystery? What's the questions? How do things fit together? And then once you've done it, to allow the organization to evolve, to include people. Incidentally, it turns out the directors love to go to other people's brain trust meetings because they could go in, they could offer their suggestions. It was a break from what they're doing, which they need also. You're going to put your head on a different problem. Then they could walk out of the room and they didn't have more responsibility for it. So it was just a good time for them, and it was a big win all the way around. So it's that kind of thread of trying to figure out how things work, how people interact, that resulted in both studios being better off. Well, this is a very, very important question. It applies across a lot of fields. Over the last 50 years, basically since the invention of the transistor, there's been a fairly consistent improvement in processing power, costs, obviously with the computers, and we're very aware of that. That's what Moore's Law is about. But in fact, there are a large number of areas where there are cumulative exponential processes that are going on, both in terms of bandwidth, resolutions, costs of sensors, ability of sensors. Just a lot of these things are happening simultaneously, and it's continuing. So if you recognize the nature of these exponential processes, and exponential doesn't necessarily mean really fast, but it has a certain character about it, then you recognize that things are going to change. And I believe that if something changes by roughly an order of magnitude, then it's very difficult for us to accurately predict what's going to happen. That some new surprises are going to happen, and we don't know what they are. If we're paying attention, then we have a rough idea. For instance, it's fairly obvious because it's been so consistent that compute power continues to increase. So you can begin to count on it for a certain number of years, but it applies in other areas also. So you pay attention to that, and surprising things are going to happen. So in our case, we rely upon these technical advances which are outside of computer graphics, but we're working within computer graphics, building new algorithms because the processes are faster and various other things are changing. So there's nothing stable in the picture. Not only is the technology changing, but the skill set of the users coming into the company, the knowledge of the people who are developing the tools, general algorithmic technologies are being advanced, and the expectations of customers are changing. There is nothing stable whatsoever in this picture. One has to actually buy into that. So you say, okay, I'm going to set it up knowing that things are going to change. So we can't do it all ourselves. So we have our technical people and R&D people who are trying to advance in ways that are of importance to us. And I believe very strongly that we stay very strongly connected to other parts of the industry and to academia. So as an example, Pixar and Disney Animation publish all of our R&D. Now, a lot of companies wouldn't do that. And there are reasons why you don't publish some things. So I'm not saying our solution is the one that's necessarily right for everyone. But for us, the reason we did that was that I know that technology continues to change. And if we think that we're going to lock into some secret and keep it away from other people, it's a delusion, an illusion. We're deluded to think that. That in fact, the best thing we can do is to publish the idea. It might help other people, but that isn't our goal. Our goal is to get the best people working for us. And the best people like to be engaged in a broader community. So we took a very active role in participating in a broader community, which itself is built upon change and advancement. So we will keep changing our technology. Our R&D group keeps introducing new ways of doing things. And when we introduce something new, it can be painful at times, sometimes very painful, but it's what we have to do at every level: storytelling, technology, process. There's just nothing stable. So it's one of those things like, get over it. That's life. Life doesn't stay the same. And we usually get in trouble when people try to sort of grab on to what they have. And it's not the way life really works. It actually gets in your way of advancement. Well, when I was first at New York Tech, this is just after I got my doctor's degree, and I was the director of the computer research lab there at New York Tech. I had some theories about how to manage, and what I found was about half my ideas were wrong. But I figured that when I got to Lucasfilm, I'd probably make the same number of mistakes. I just make different ones. And it's the one thing that I've held on to, was the fact that it's just a consequence of doing something new, that you're just wrong about half the time, and that it's not like you're trying to avoid being wrong. It's just like you are going to be wrong, and you buy into it. And so my advice to anybody that's young is to not think in terms of mistakes actually as sort of failures or something embarrassing. It's like, oh, I want to be doing something such that I am likely to be wrong half the time. If I'm not, then I'm not growing and I'm not pushing things. So really the advice is just to completely, deeply accept the fact that you're wrong half the time. And if you accept that, then you think about it in different ways and it frees you up. This issue is a very important one for us. Clearly, many of us are very concerned in the U.S. about the division that's taking place, and the fact that there's a minority of people who've actually seized control of some of the elements of power. And the problem is we've got really serious worldwide existential problems that need the best minds around the world to work on. And it's going to require a great deal of creativity. The one thing I know is that when people operate out of fear of judgment, or other things that get in the way, then that energy is not being applied towards solving the problems. And what we need to do is to make the environment safe for people to address the problems. At a personal level, I know that in the last while, across the Europe and the U.S. and various places in the country, people are trying to address some of the problems having to do with biases against people, whether because of ethnicity or gender or culture. And it's a serious problem. What I have learned is, or realized, I should say, because we all have our own lenses through which we view the world and our own biases. And at first I thought, I need to get rid of the biases. And then I realized, well, that's not going to happen. That in fact, I can never be another gender, I can never be another ethnicity, and I can never be raised in another culture, which means there are experiences that I can never have. But what I can have is the faith and the belief that the experiences that other people have are of great value, even if I can't see them. And the environment that I want to have is one in which the people with those differences are able to participate, because what they bring to the table is of great value in solving the problems and addressing the fear and the blocks for encouraging and bringing in people into what are really important problems is a critical next step for our civilization, for the sake of civilization. Well, an underestimated gem. I mean, for me, the films are different. There are two or three which just stand out, but I don't know if they're underestimated. I think other people value them. The one I love is Ratatouille. Another one is Up. And one of the things I like about those two movies is if you look at the original premise. So for Ratatouille, it's a movie about a rat that wants to cook. And in Up, it's about a grieving widow, his old man, and his wife has died, and he floats away in a balloon, and there's a stowaway scout on this house when it floats away. All right. When you first hear these ideas, they don't make any sense whatsoever. They cannot possibly succeed. It doesn't matter how successful the movies are. You aren't going to sell a lot of rat toys. And you're not going to sell a lot of toy walkers. So I take pride in the fact that we took on something which was difficult and unlikely. But underneath it, there was an emotional drive from the directors about a story, about something deep inside. And by doing something unusual, they can get that idea out. So Ratatouille was one of the more profound films in my mind because it used an unusual technique to talk about creation and art and the love of art. And because in the case of Ratatouille, he wasn't trying to be the best chef in the world. He just wanted to be great at what he did. That was it. And that's what people should do. That's what artists should do, or technical people or business people. It's like, do something good that people appreciate. And it's that sentiment that came out in an unusual film. And that's the thing that elevates it to among the top films that we've made.
Welcome back, Ed. So we have a series of questions from the audience, and no surprise, a lot of questions are about creativity and how do you foster creativity in an organization. So let's begin with this one. How do you ensure that Pixar employees have the time and brain space needed to be creative, balancing the concept of productivity output with creativity?
Well, all of them would like more time to think because they value that space where you let something move around in your head, but at the same time, making the films is this long, laborious process where they're always behind schedule. The real issues are, one is that people believe that what they're working on is going to be of value and have an impact. That if you are doing something like that, or you believe you're having an impact and the people around you believe it, then you're actually engaging them in solving problems and pulling on their full energy. So really, our biggest job is to ensure that we're working on something which is of real value, perceived to be of value, and that we've created an environment in which people are, in which people feel safe to try something, knowing that if they try something and it doesn't work, that's okay.
Okay, and do deadlines help or not for creativity?
Well, good artists recognize that they operate within constraints. So a deadline is a constraint. And it's true, I think this is true with most projects. If the deadline, in fact, is not realistic, then you actually block the creativity because you have to go back to repeat things that are known to work. If you give them too much time, then people don't make decisions. They just keep adding to the list of things that need to be worked on. And that boundary between too much time and too little time is very fuzzy. So you're making a gut instinct as to what the deadline should be. But in fact, you do need the deadline sometimes to force the decisions. If you've got 10,000 opportunities, then the deadline actually forces you to sort your possibilities and then make your decisions and see what works together. And again, there's it's an art form of looking at what motivates people, what do they want to do, and how do you make the environment so they're going to do their very best.
Okay, so is technology driving creativity, or is it the other way around?
Well, that was one of the cool things when Roy Disney was part of the process of doing a hostile takeover of Disney. This is when Michael Eisner came in, and Roy Disney Jr. Was putting together this deal to take over Disney. But when that was done, Roy wanted to bring technology into Disney Animation, and that's when we entered into our contract with Disney. And the motivation that Roy Disney had was that something he learned from his uncle, Walt Disney, which was that Walt always was introducing new technology into the animation industry. We don't look at it as new technology now, but it certainly was at the time. And Walt realized that by combining the two together, you created this energy. And that's what Roy wanted to bring back when he entered into the contract with Disney. And if we look at the history of Pixar, as well as the time at Lucasfilm, George Lucas understood this. He was making the movies, Star Wars, which was funding this, but at the same time, he was investing in technology to change the industry. The change in the technology creates new opportunities for the artists. And the artists are always asking for things that can't quite be done. Well, okay, which comes first? and the reality is that they go hand in hand. And the one thing I've learned is that if you actually look at the organizational skills or the leadership skills or the creative skills and compare them between the technical people and the artistic, is the statistics are about the same. That is, there are disorganized technical people and there are really organized artists, and vice versa. So what I found is the creativity applies to both groups in very similar ways, and that when you tie them all together, then they feed on each other, and this is generalizable. It's like if you're working on any product out there in the world, in any field, it's that when you interact with other people or with other companies or with other customers, that you're going to learn something that you didn't know. And that the creativity is in fact a co-creation with information and views coming from different people, each of whom can see things that others can't see.
Okay. And you personally, what has been one of your greatest source of inspiration?
Well, at the beginning of my life, I was inspired by two people in particular who were iconic figures of the time, which was Walt Disney and Einstein. And since they were the two iconic figures, and one was on the artistic side and the other one was on the scientific side, they actually always felt like they belonged together. So then in moving into the field of putting them together, there were numerous people along the way that I found inspiring. But I have to say that one of the most impactful things for me was that in the 70s, when I was in graduate school, there was the program called ARPA, which was the U.S. government funding research around the United States with extremely low bureaucracy overhead. That is, they were trusting people to help solve the problems of the day. And there weren't a lot of reports. People weren't making wild projections about stuff. It's basically a trust-based system, believing that the principal investigators or the professors at the universities wanted their students to do good work. And that was all they did. And it basically was world-changing, but it was one that wasn't actually highly directed. It was one that was based upon trust. And it was pretty remarkable, and it was very effective, one that I believe in to this day.
Okay, the next question is referring to the concept of why for a company, and it is introduced by Simon Sinek. I don't know if you have heard about him, and it says that every company should focus on defining a why, a reason why they are operating. What would you say is the why of Pixar?
Well, Pixar is in an industry of telling stories. Stories are the way that we communicate with each other, starting at a very young age. Something about, reading a book to a child sitting in your lap. You're storytelling, but you're also connecting in the process of doing that. Articles in magazines or newspapers or what we see on television are storytelling. It's how we communicate. And what we wanted and want is to be able to have something which is of meaning and be able to connect with people through the stories, and recognizing that is our primary mode of communication. Now the thing is, can we do it well? Can we help others do it well? And are we doing it for the right reasons? And are we drawing deeply into something in the world or in real life, whether from inside or from people that we learn from, to do something which is meaningful? And I'm just always been strongly driven by that. So how do you provide meaning for people in the world?
Okay. What do you think sets Pixar apart from the other animation studios?
Well, first of all, other animation studios also done some very good work. I remember when was that Spider-Man and the Spider-Verse came out. They did really an extraordinarily good job. And I appreciate that whenever somebody does it. We're not secret about our process. And the film industry, and I think it's true with a lot of them. And yeah, when your film comes out, you're competing with others, but the reality is you want other people to do a good job. You don't want everybody to do something poor and you say, well, okay, we're better than everybody else. It's like, no, actually, we're all better off if everyone does better. So I don't think about competition in the same sort of way. But the primary job at Pixar is to make sure that we do a good job. And I'd say the focus has been really good there. For so many years, people have not lost track of what's important as you communicate with others. And currently, the chief creative person officer at Pixar is Pete Docter. Pete Docter made Inside Out and Up and Soul, and he's a person that really tries to find meaning in what he does. And the important thing for us is that we never forget that we're trying to come up with real meaning. We're not trying to churn something out to get it, just to get something done. It's to always hold on to deep meaning that underlies any good story.
And what is the secret sauce of Pixar? Rather process or rather people?
Well, the ideal is that people are jointly trying to solve the problems. So we don't think of the process even of one of failing. I mean, we sometimes use the term like fail fast or fail often, but that isn't actually the way people normally think about things, largely because failure is a loaded term. It's you try something, it doesn't work, and you try something else. And those aren't actual failures, they're just trying things and finding out what works. And that's an ongoing process, and it's a way of thinking. The trick is to make it safe to do that, because people, they do want to look good. They've got their own emotional issues or desires or needs. And we recognize the reality of that. So our job is to make it safe to do something and not become attached to a particular idea that they've got. So if something fits, good. If it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. That's not a judgment on the person who came up with an idea. It's part of the process. And it's a subtle thing, but it's really putting focus on the safety in the room so that people can fully participate without letting their ego get in the way of problem solving.
So it's very interesting because this dimension has been mentioned a couple of times during these 2 days. So, what has been your biggest challenge at Pixar?
Well, every once in a while you get hit with a surprise, and I'd mentioned this before during the interview that's kind of what happens in life. Is that you're going to get surprises. And the nature of surprises, they're different every time. If you could foresee it coming, then it's not a surprise. So it's acknowledging that we're going to have things that we don't foresee. And every once in a while, when the thing finally arises as a problem, we will realize that, okay, we're about to go off a cliff. And so we'll have, we don't call it this, but we'll have the going off the cliff summit to talk about what we're going to do. Now, what's in common is that as a group, there's enough trust and ownership in the company that we can have that meeting and it's focused on the problem. It's not focused on individuals. It's like, how do we solve the problem? And everybody owns it. And I know it's the opposite of your question, but when I actually feel the best is when we have a serious problem and we meet with the leadership, and the rest of the leadership isn't saying, what are you going to do about it? Their whole demeanor is that they own the problem. We're all in this together. And that's when we do our best problem solving. The problems are different every time, but it's the way we trust each other that makes the difference for the group.
Okay, there has been a lot of conversation over the years about stereotypes that are played out and reinforced in children's films. How has Pixar worked to create more inclusive narratives?
Well, as we started, excuse me, as we started in this, we were so focused on getting it right that there were clearly things that we missed early on in terms of inclusivity. But as we realized this and realized our obligation, then we worked basically to acknowledge our own blindnesses and weak spots, and then work to fix them. Part of that is in the filmmaking itself. As we've gone out, we've tried to learn something about other cultures or the way people think, is to try to dive beneath the surface. But at the same time, when you do that, you have to apply it to yourself too. It's like, are we missing something? Are our own is our own lack of understanding getting in our way? And the answer, of course, is yeah, it is. So what do we do about it? And it's a continual process, but it's to ensure that people from other ethnicities are participating, that women are directing films, that in terms of the casting of the voices in the film, do we, without thinking about it, a lot of biases come through because we don't think about it. And so for us, it's a responsibility to be better ourselves as we try to do something better with our films.
And how many people are working on a single production? How many different people are working on a single project?
Well, we have got the main group of people are either on the films themselves or supporting in some capacity. We also have an R&D group, technical groups, but the number of people who are directly on the film, as cast in the film, I think is around 300 people. I'm not actually sure of the number, largely because it turns out that a lot of people are supporting, but they're not officially on the film. So whether it's in the systems or the finance, then that's actually their full-time job, is to make sure that everything around the company is supporting what we're doing. So all I can say is I think it's roughly 300 direct, but basically all the studio does is make these films. So it's like everybody does. And so everybody's on the film. So if you look at the credits, then we have people on the kitchen staff, they're on the credits because they're part of the company. They're our colleagues. And we want the message that we value the people who are supporting in various capacities, and that they bring something to the company.
And in our field, we have a recurring question, which is how do you structure your team? Do you structure your team by specialties and expertise, or do you structure your team by use cases and value that you are delivering to your client? What is the way you structure this 300 people?
Well, there are two parts to that. One of them is that we clearly have to have structure. Making a film is because it's got hundreds of people involved with it, and there are literally tens or hundreds of thousands of elements that have to be put together. Then one needs not only structure, but some really sophisticated people who can figure out how it all puts together and how it is organized. So there is, in essence, on each film, it's like this. It's interesting pairing because you've got a director and a producer, and the director is responsible for the creative content, and the producer is responsible for how all of it fits together. And they need to have a good relationship because they're both part of making the film. They're all a critical part of it. And then there is a structure of departments across the company, and then there's the staffing of the people, the departments within the show. So with that structure, the other thing we have to do, though, is to ensure that we don't get stifled by it. That is, it's so complicated that we can't really have it be top-down hierarchical. Not that companies don't try that at times, or that sometimes there are people who want to know everything and basically operate a command and control structure. But that's not the way that we want to work. We need to have the structure, but at the same time, we have to have anybody to be able to talk with anybody else to be able to directly solve the problem without having to go through the channels. Because if you go through the channels of the organization, you sometimes just really slow things up. So that's the balance. Structure, you've got a deadline. You actually want some hard limits to help in the process, but at the same time, you want the freedom for somebody to just go randomly talk to anybody else, and then the leaders find out about the discussion after it took place, and they're not approving it or getting in the way of the process.
And maybe a last question, and I think you have had it 1,000 of times, but so a couple of people are eager to know, how was it to work with Steve Jobs?
It was amazing. I believe I worked for Steve longer continuously than anybody else. And what a lot of people miss is that he went through an arc in his life. Remember, he was kicked out of Apple. A difficult thing for him. He put together the company, which was Next, to produce computers. And in the end, Next didn't really make it as a company, but they produced this amazing operating system, which became the basis for Apple buying Next to then get Apple back on track. Pixar at one point failed financially, and Steve basically bailed us out. It had great expense to him. So the real story of Steve Jobs is that of the hero's journey. He did have some behavior early on, which wasn't very good, and he's well known for it. And that's the thing that people want to tell stories about. But what happened was Steve went through the classic hero's journey, which was he got kicked out of his kingdom. He wandered around in the wilderness and made some mistakes, but he was so smart that he learned from them and he changed. And about 30 years ago, he went through some fairly dramatic changes. Got married to and had this great relationship with his wife and some kids. And he became a very empathetic person, very different than the Steve that I first knew. And when he made that change, the people who were with him stayed with him for the rest of his life. And the reason that most people miss that part of the story is people weren't talking about Steve after he'd gone through this. But the person that you read about in his early career is not the person who made this Apple, which changed the world. It was the Steve who came back, the changed person. That's the one to emulate. It's that personal journey. It's the kind of journey that I would hope that most of us would go through. Like we go through life, you're thrown things that throw you off, and you learn from them. And Steve was brilliant at understanding what worked or what didn't work, and he would change when he realized something didn't work. And that was the real message. That was the Steve that I knew, was this person that was open. He was about the topic. He was passionate. And this is a hard thing to understand. He was really committed and passionate, but he also knew how to change his mind when he realized that he was wrong. And he was wrong at times, and he changed. So the Steve that I knew at the end was completely different than the one that people sometimes imagine. But the brilliance, the insight was pretty phenomenal, and the loyalty. So basically, he was an impactful and great friend.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you for your presence. It's been really a great honor. Thank you very much for the very beautiful memories you have created for all of us, I'm sure. And have a good day. Thank you.
It's my pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.